Right. Hello, everyone. We are coming in today for the next video that we have finally gotten the chance to get to. So I think it's been since May since we last did one. So for today's video, we are going to go ahead and discuss a topic that I originally had planned to discuss back in April. Things ended up happening just before April that I just had a whole bunch of stuff going on and never really got to it. And I figured now we could finally go ahead and go over this, especially given that we are nearing the 250th anniversary, and I'm looking to try to do some more of the Revolutionary War era videos. So this will kind of be our last one dealing not in that for a little bit. So this is going to deal, of course, with anyone that has watched this channel before knows that I myself, along with a lot of other people, are very big fanatics. Well, have a very big interest in the Titanic disaster, and this is going to deal with one of the greatest shipwrecks that has ever happened in human history. And what we're going to discuss today is the case of the ship that pretty much, in large part, watched Titanic sink and did nothing. Did absolutely nothing to help people in the water. Now, you could go 50 dozen ways with whether or not the ship could have actually done something. It's still something that is highly debated to this day of whether or not they would have actually been able to help at all. I myself am conflicted on whether or not it would have been of use, but the fact that the ship did likely see Titanic sinking and just did nothing, didn't even think to do anything, that is, in my opinion, pretty disgusting. So, the ship in question, for those of you who are familiar with Titanic history, you have probably heard before of a ship called the Californian. For those of you who are not very familiar with the story, Californian was a small British steamer. It belonged to the Leyland Line, which was another transatlantic line running routes across the North Atlantic. And Californian was out in the North Atlantic on the same night that Titanic was. Her course was heading to Boston, Massachusetts, where Titanic was heading to New York City, but they were in the same vicinity, crossing around the same area together. And Californian's claim to fame here is factor that she was very much within range of Titanic, like probably well within 25 miles, actually saw the ship's distress rockets go off and just sat there in the middle of the night and did nothing, mostly through the inaction of her captain. So, to go through this whole thing here, we're going to give an overview of what exactly happened with California, what went on, and some of the investigation that happened afterward, just to kind of give an overview of this controversial topic amongst Titanic historians, because to this day, as I said, it is a very big debate of whether or not, had the Californian actually responded, would they have been able to actually really save that many more people? Mind you, they were nowhere near as big of a ship as Titanic, and it's doubtful that they could have even gotten everybody aboard, let alone they're in the same ice field. And that is going to play a part into some of the reason why California was not moving. So, Californian, as we mentioned, it's heading to Boston, Massachusetts. She had departed Liverpool, England on April 5th for Boston. Titanic would depart Southampton, England on April 10th, so about 5 days after California would actually depart. Her captain, by the name of Stanley Lord, had been in command of the ship since March of 1911, which was the previous year. California would depart Liverpool with only cargo and crew. She was not carrying any paying passengers on this voyage, and she was going to head out to Boston. Probably would take about a week, I think, about a week and a half for the ship. Now, Lord's subordinates included George Stewart, who was chief officer of Californian, Herbert Stone, who was the second officer, Charles Groves, who was the third officer, and apprentice officer James Gibson. Now, the first week of Californian's Atlantic crossing was uneventful, largely uneventful. They didn't really have any major events happen. That was until Sunday of April 14th, the same day that Titanic will end up hitting the berg late at night. And just to give you guys a visual of California here, this is the ship we are going to be discussing. So, not a very big ship, only has a single funnel, has 4 masts, and she is very much smaller than Titanic. I think she's probably about Carpathia's size. This picture actually was taken the morning of the April 15th by a passenger on Carpathia as California actually came up into the wreck area and was checking to see if they could lend any assistance. So this was taken that very morning in the area that Titanic had sank of California. So on April 14th, that is when the voyage starts to encounter some road bumps. At around 6:30 p.m. ship's time, Californian's wireless operator Cyril Evans signaled to the ship Antillean that there were three large icebergs about 5 miles north of Californian's current position. This message was also received by the neighboring Titanic, which was close, and it was delivered to Titanic's bridge. We know for a fact that this message was delivered by one of the two wireless operators. By 10:20 p.m., Californian came to a complete stop as it was just short of a very, very large ice field. And Captain Lord is seeing this and he makes the deducement, I'm not going to try to steam my way through that. There's no moon, there's no waves. It's going to be hard as all get out to see a berg. So I'm not going to take the chance and try to steam through that in the middle of the night because this is a massive ice field ahead of me. So in defense of Lord in this part, I will give Lord and credence in this part. He chooses wisely to stop. He chooses absolutely to stop for the night. We will proceed in the morning. And that's probably the wisest thing that he could have done for his ship. Something that Titanic probably should have considered, or at least really taken into consideration the circumstances, which Captain Smith had not really, I think, appreciated what Titanic was steaming into. He kept his ship going at near full speed and relied that the lookouts would be able to visually sight any iceberg or any kind of danger well before the ship would get anywhere close to one, which obviously did not happen. Lookouts, when they finally spotted the berg that Titanic struck, had about 30 seconds between their sighting of the berg and the ship's impact. So for Lord to come to the deducement, looking at these same circumstances, and he's coming to the same ice field a little earlier than Titanic, and he makes the correct deducement. I'm not chancing going through that in the middle of the black pitch of night. I'm just going to stop the ship. We'll proceed in the morning. We don't have any paying passengers. We're not in a hurry. So around 10 p.m., Lord saw what appeared to be a steamer coming up from the east, from the way that California had come. And he goes and asks he mentions this to his officers on the bridge, and Third Officer Groves thought that it might be just a falling star. He had seen this light as well. By 10:45 p.m., about 15 minutes later, it becomes very clear that the lights that they're seeing to the east are not a falling star. They're not a shooting star. It is the lights of a very large steamer. And Lord and them, you make the deducement it's coming up from about the southeast. This would be about the direction that Titanic would have been approaching to California. Now, Lord would ask Cyril Evans, the wireless operator, if he knew of any, any ships in the near vicinity. Are there any large steamers in the vicinity? And Evans replied that only the Titanic was known to be close. Now, Lord thought that the lights that he was seeing were too small of a ship to have been the Titanic, and he insists that it was a ship closer in size to his own. That this was not the Titanic. The Titanic's huge. Like this can't be it. I beg to differ that it probably wasn't. I think it probably was because keep in mind, I don't know, he is a couple miles off, things are gonna appear smaller, and it's the only ship that's reported to be in the vicinity. And he sees these lights coming up from the exact same direction that Titanic would be approaching at about that time. So Lord, nonetheless, would instruct Evans to contact the Titanic and inform them that they were stopped by ice and warn her of the oncoming ice field. This was about 10:45ish on April 14th at night. Now, when Evans tried messaging Titanic, the senior wireless operator Jack Phillips on Titanic was very busy sending a backlog of passenger messages to Cape Race, Newfoundland. The wireless set on Titanic had actually broken down the previous day. The two wireless operators, Jack Phillips and his junior wireless partner Harold Bride, had spent the entire day trying to get the thing back up and operational, which eventually they were able to do, but in the process, they now had a massive backlog of private passenger messages that were waiting to be sent. And Phillips was now working frantically to try to get as many of these sent as he could. And as they're nearing the wireless station at Cape Race, Newfoundland, they're nearing the wireless range of that. They're about 400 miles or so from Newfoundland, Canada. Phillips is now trying to shoot these messages off. Now, due to the close proximity of California to Titanic, the message was likely extremely loud in the wireless headset that Phillips was wearing, and Phillips very rapidly responded to Evans's cut-in with the reply of, "Keep out, shut up, you're jamming my signal, I'm working Cape Race." Evans he kind of just stops. He does not try to contact Titanic again, and he later said during the testimony during the inquiries that he didn't feel offended by Phillips's messages. He kind of understood that yes, I got a backlog of messages. I can I can understand maybe he is a little irritated if I'm trying to cut in. So he didn't take it as a personal slight. But shortly after that, Evans decided that, I'm going to go to bed. By 11:30 p.m., the approaching ship was close enough that Lord could see the starboard green marker light on the ship, which is another thing that is lining up that this could be Titanic. He's seeing the starboard green marker light, indicating that this ship was traveling west towards the ice. And this would be the same light side that if you're looking at the Titanic, California would be to the north of Titanic. They're both heading to the west. So Californian would be seeing the starboard side of Titanic, and they would be seeing a green marker light. Lord estimated that the ship that he saw was only maybe about 5 miles away, and he asked Third Officer Grooves to keep a watch on the ship as he left the bridge. At 11:35 p.m., wireless operator Cyril Evans, who was the only wireless operator that Californian had, decided that he would go to bed. He did not bother to rewind the detector on the wireless set to receive messages while he was away. So it was not going to actually receive anything that was sent after he turned the thing off. And back then, this was standard practice. There was no law back in 1912, at this time at least, that stipulated that that ships had to have more than one wireless operator, and there was no law saying that they had to have a 24-hour radio watch, which was going to be a very big issue that night. And Titanic's sinking would end up changing that. So Evans is going to go to bed at 11:35 p.m. 5 minutes after he goes to bed, Titanic strikes the iceberg at about 11:40. At midnight, Lord retired to his cabin at midnight on the 15th, and he instructed Second Officer Stone to notify him if the ship in the distance moved any closer. At about 12:05 a.m., Jack Phillips on Titanic, who at this point the ship is struck the iceberg and is starting to sink, sends out what becomes Titanic's first distress call of the night. Californian, due to Cyril Evans both being asleep and its own wireless set being off, does not receive that message. By around 12:15 a.m., Third Officer Grooves stops by the wireless room to listen in to any messages. He is unaware of the equipment. He is not familiar with wireless equipment. He just stops in there to put the headset on and see if he could hear anything. He doesn't hear anything, presumes that, there's nothing important, and just takes them off and leaves. He's not a wireless man. He does not really know. He knows nothing about the factor that the detector is not rewound. He knows nothing about that. He turns it on, nothing. But he does not realize that the detector has not been rewound, and thus he has no inclination that there is a ship sending distress signals. Titanic would send in the time between 12:15 and 12:30, right around the time that Grooves is turning on the wireless set to listen to see if there's any messages, but the detector's not rewound. Titanic shot off a total of about 10 distress messages within that 15-minute time period, and California heard none of them. At around 12:30, several of the crew, including Second Officer Stone on the bridge, witnessed a white flash to the south. They thought it was a shooting star at first when they first saw it. However, they soon saw a second flash and made the realization that this was not a shooting star. These were rockets. Stone would report the rockets to Captain Lord, who told him to keep an eye on the ship that was firing them. He also instructed him to try to contact the ship through Morse lamp, but Stone would fail to get any sort of a response from the ship in the distance. By about 1:15 a.m., Stone would report to Lord that rockets were still being fired. Lord asked if they were private signals, and Stone replied to not know whether or not which they were, and he noted that they were white in color, which was another thing we have to set aside here in 1912. Rockets were used for a variety of things. There was no standardized use for rockets. And in 1912, every ship carried rockets, but there wasn't like specific colors or anything that were set aside to mean specific things. There were certain colors that were generally, used for certain things, but there was no actually like code of conduct or regulations that kind of stipulated that this color means this color means that. So, and they could fire them off for different reasons. Some ships fired them off for celebrations. So Stone isn't completely aware. All he knows is there's a ship in the distance to the south that we can see the lights of, and now the thing is firing white rockets. Why is it firing white rockets? He's also noted to Lord that the ship has stopped. It seems to have come to a complete halt. It's not moving anymore. And that is right in line with Titanic, who's to the south, The ship is stopped at this point. It is now sinking, and Titanic fires 8 rockets that night, all white in color. Now, Lord would order Stone keep trying to signal the ship by Morse lamp, and when you get an answer, and his thing to Stone was reportedly, "When you get an answer, let me know." Strangely, Stone noted, and this is one thing that deviates that, okay, what ship are they seeing? Because Stone noted that he saw the vessel's red port side light at one point. Now, Titanic is, yes, both ships are drifting now that they're stopped because they're not just sitting still, obviously, because the current's carrying them now. They're just because they're not moving on their own power doesn't mean that they're not being slowly drifted south by the currents. But as to why Stone would have seen the red port light on the ship to the south if this was Titanic makes absolutely no sense, unless there was another ship. And that's another one of the great mysteries is that Stone did testify that he had seen at one point a red port light, a red port side light, but at no point would Titanic have completely flipped, 180 and gone the other way. The direction of the wreck itself tells us that the ship was still facing the direction it come, in particular with the bow, which is still facing the direction that the ship was traveling. It's still on the seabed in that direction, heading to the west, with the stern that flipped around a bit. Stone would grow increasingly anxious as he watched the ship to the south, watching this mystery vessel, and he made several comments about it to Apprentice Officer James Gibson, who was on the bridge with him. Comments such as, "A ship is not going to fire rockets at sea for nothing." And he was seemingly concerned that Lord wasn't really taking this into account. Gibson himself would later testify, making remarks such as, "Everything was not all right with her." And even this ominous remark that he noticed at one point that she looks to have a big side out of the water. And at one point, Stone had also said the comment, "She looks very queer out of the water. Her lights look queer, almost as though she was leaning or tilting or listing of some sort, just like Titanic would have been at that point." By about 2 a.m., it appeared that the other ship was leaving the area, as the lights were seeming to disappear, and all that could be seen was a white stern light to the southwest. Now, at this point, yes, we know Titanic is drifting, and at about 2 a.m., Titanic's coming to the end. This could have been a little bit after 2 a.m. I think this was their estimate of when it was. And what we could deduce here is if it was that white stern light, could it have been Californian's officers seeing Titanic's final death throes, where the ship has now lost power, it is broken half. But one of the lights I believe that managed to stay on even after the breakup was the aft mast light on the stern, was one of the last lights that went out. It did not fail when the power went off when the ship broke in half. It stayed on until it was submerged. So could it have been Californian's officers witnessing Titanic's final death throes of the stern finally going under after the breakup? Stone sent Gibson to inform Captain Lord immediately, who was also told that the ship had fired a total of 8 rockets, the same number fired by Titanic that night. Lord would simply inquire as to the certainty of the rockets. Are you sure they were rockets? Are you sure they weren't falling stars or something? And to the color of them. And then he went back to bed, seemingly unconcerned. Lord would awake at about 4 a.m., and with dawn appearing at around 5:15 a.m., he decided to try to navigate the ice field now that the sun was coming up and he could actually see, and seeing how massive an ice field it was. He also saw a four-masted ship to the southwest. And at about the same time, Californians officers had noticed some green rockets being fired to the south, and they wondered, who's firing rockets now? This would also be the direction at about this time that Carpathia is coming up on the wreck site, and she's starting to fire rockets to try to let the lifeboats know that help is on the way. And Carpathia was a four-masted sailing vessel, and this likely is the ship that Lord is seeing come dawn. Now, concerned that the ship that he was seeing was in trouble, Lord ordered Evans awakened and to contact the ship to the south to see if they knew anything about the rockets during the night. Maybe they're the ones that were firing them because they were just firing them a short while ago. Evans rewounds his detector as soon as he gets up, and he immediately receives a message reporting that Titanic had sunk during the middle of the night, and even more egregiously, it had sunk only about 19 miles to the south. Lord, immediately upon getting this news from Evans, orders Californian to steam west, first to get through the ice field, the bulk of it, and then south toward the area of the sinking at full speed once they are clear of the ice. He encounters the ship Mount Temple near where the iceberg was supposedly struck, where Titanic had reportedly struck the iceberg, but seeing no wreckage, continued further south around about 7:30 a.m. He would cite Carpathia to the east and confirm that she was picking up survivors, that she had found survivors of the Titanic. California would end up pulling alongside Carpathia at about 9 a.m. on April 15th. After confirming Carpathia had all the survivors, it then departed to search for more. They had pulled up alongside. Lord asked if they needed any assistance. Rostron of the Carpathia pretty much confirms at that point that we think, all the boats that are accounted for, all the survivors that can be found. And Californian then says, "Okay, we'll go out in the wreckage area and we'll see if we can find any more. But you can go ahead and go on your way." After finding none, after searching the wreckage area for a few hours and finding nothing but minor pieces of floating wreckage, Lord would order course for Boston. Californian would arrive at Boston on April 19th, unnoticed, the same day that the U.S. Senate inquiry is going to start. So again, this was the picture taken that morning by someone on Carpathia, the ship Californian pulling up. This here is the picture of picture of Captain Lord. He was about, I think, 34 at the time. So as I mentioned, the same day that Californian arrives in Boston, the U.S. Senate inquiry into the disaster is starting, and because the survivors in Carpathia had gotten back to New York City just the day prior on April 18th. On April 20th, at first, like I say, California gets into Boston, no one really notices anything because at this point, the world's just learning the details of this disaster. And it isn't until the 22nd of April that the world becomes aware through the testimony at the U.S. inquiry that there was an unknown ship near Titanic that had failed to respond to its distress signals. On April 23rd, the very next day, a New England newspaper would print a story claiming that Californian was the ship that had refused to aid Titanic. The story on the newspaper came from an interview with Californian's carpenter, James McGregor, who said that he saw Titanic's lights and rockets that night. The Boston American newspaper soon printed a near identical story from another Californian crew member and Assistant Engineer Ernest Gill. Captain Lord had also been giving interviews to several of the local newspapers in Boston, but strangely, some of his accounts had been conflicting with each other. On April 19th, upon first getting to Boston, he told the Boston Traveler that his ship had been about 30 miles away from the Titanic that night. However, just a couple days later, on April 24th, when he was giving an interview to the Boston Post, he said that it had only been about 20 miles. So he went from 30 to 20. Why are you changing your position so quick? He would also claim to have searched the wreck site for roughly 3 hours after upon reaching the scene, but Third Officer Groves insisted that the ship had only searched it for around 2, not 3. Lord would decline to give reporters another sign that something was up. Lord declined to give many of the reporters his exact position of his ship that night, stating that the information was, quote, state secrets, as if he knew that he was close, knew he had messed up, and didn't want it to get out. On April 23rd, the Senate inquiry issued subpoenas for multiple Californian crew members, including Assistant Engineer Ernest Gill and Captain Lord himself. Gill would repeat his claims at the inquiry and testify to seeing Titanic's lights and rockets being fired that night. Lord's testimony conflicted itself, and it kept changing during the course of the inquiry. He would detail 3 different ice conditions. He also admitted to knowing about the rockets, despite telling the papers that he hadn't seen or known about any, and insisted that they weren't distress rockets. He also would insist that the ship firing them was too small to be Titanic, which was he supposed that there was a third ship. Now, this was based on Lord's his own observations, which we know before they had actually contacted Titanic. When Lord had first seen the lights of that ship approaching to the south, he had not thought it was Titanic. When Evans had told him that that was the only ship close, he thought the ship he was seeing was much smaller. Testimony from the U.S. Navy and hydrographer's office made the case that Titanic and Californian were within visual range of each other, and that there was no reported third vessel anywhere within that area at the time. The ship's scrap logs, where info was pulled from into the main log at the selection of the ship's captain, were destroyed due to company policy at the time, which complicated matters. Lord could pick and choose what information went into that official log, and since the scrap logs were destroyed after information was taken from them and compiled into the official ship's log, there was no way of getting a hold of those scrap logs to actually see what had been noted on that night, because there was no mention of the encounter of the strange ship to the south in the official ship's log. At the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry, which would convene on May 2nd, Lord and his crew would give evasive and conflicting testimonies to the British inquiry as well. Lord claimed to have not been told that the nearby ship had disappeared, which contradicted James Gibson, who testified that he had done so and was even acknowledged by the captain when he told him. Titanic survivors also testified to seeing another ship after hitting the iceberg. Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall, who had been the one to calculate Titanic's distress position that night and had been the one directing the firing of the rockets, said that it appeared off the Titanic's bow at what he estimated at about 5 miles away, and apparently, at first, he thought was heading towards them. He had tried to signal the ship with Morse lamps, but had gotten no response, which was awfully strange because Californian Lord had actually directed his officers on the bridge when they told him about the ship to try to contact the ship with Morse lamp, which they tried. But both on Titanic and Californian, men tried to contact the ship in the distance with a Morse lamp, but neither one saw any response, which is another big mystery to this. Lookout Frederick Fleet, who had been the man to sight the iceberg that had doomed the ship, he had remained in the crow's nest about 40 minutes after the collision, and he didn't see any lights of another ship until after he had gotten into a lifeboat. Captain Edward Smith, who unfortunately had went down with Titanic, but it was testified to by the surviving crew, it was said that Captain Smith had thought that the visible ship was fairly close because he had actually ordered several of the lifeboats as they got lower down the side of the ship to row toward the lights of the ship in the distance and then come back to pick up more passengers. So Captain Smith, out of his own observation, and he had been at sea for I think at least 40 years, 40 or 50, he very much thought that he saw the lights as well, and he thought the ship was close enough that, the lifeboats could row to it. One lifeboat had actually tried to row toward the lights of this mystery ship all night, but never seemed to get any closer. Both inquiries would end up concluding that Californian had to have been closer than 19 than it had to be closer than at least the 19 and a half miles that Lord claimed, and each of the two ships had supposedly been visible to each other, according to the two reports from the two inquiries. Carpathia had spotted a vessel to the north when arriving at that wreck site, which ended up turning out to be the Californian, so they knew the she was very close in the area. The inquiries concluded Lord had failed to provide proper assistance to Titanic, and that he had done that, and that had he done so, he might, and this is from the official inquiry, he might have saved many, if not all, of the lives that were lost out of 1,500 people that died. The U.S. would later pass the Radio Act of 1912, which would require a 24-hour radio watch on all ships in case of emergency, partly out of Californian's controversy where she only had one wireless operator and he was asleep at the time. A re-examination of those circumstances was later opened by the British government in 1992, but they concluded very similar results to the original 1912 inquiries. And today, there's also controversy of whether or not, now that we have some information, not just, we do have some information, obviously, now that we didn't have in 1912. We obviously know since 1985 that Titanic's reported distress position was actually incorrect. She was about 13 miles further to the east than her reported sinking location was. We now know that because we found the wreck in 1985, which also puts some difference to this. Now that we know that Titanic wasn't where she supposedly was and where all the inquiries were going off of the information, would California have visibly have seen Titanic, or was there another ship that we don't know about? At the same time, I think it is fair to say, given that Titanic was close enough, not Lord, but Californian likely did at least see Titanic's rockets. No matter what way you spin this, the fact that you were in the area, you seen white rockets to your south, 8 of them, the exact number the Titanic fired, at the exact direction she would have been, regardless if you could see the actual ship or not, the rockets would have gone higher than the ship and thus would have gone over the horizon, enough for California to see them. I think it is fair to say that California, for certain, very likely saw Titanic's distress rockets that night. And that alone is pretty messed up. That they seen the 8 rockets and did nothing, because they didn't think that they were distress signals, according to the captain. So that knowing that a ship did see those rockets and just failed to respond is pretty egregious. We also have nowadays, the discussion of, looking in hindsight without the emotion of it, would it have done much good? As we know from the picture, Californian is not a very large ship. It's nowhere near the size of Titanic. Titanic has about 2,200 passengers. Is it possible that they could have gotten every passenger on that vessel? I don't know if it is. It would have been a pretty overcrowded. Let alone, now you could make the argument they could keep people in the boats until another ship got there, and that way they could have some people in the boats and some people on the ship, which the boats alone managed to save about 705. You could make that argument. We could also make the argument, of course, that California was trapped in the same ice field that doomed Titanic, and that was the whole reason she had stopped in the first place. It was she was surrounded by ice, and had California tried to get to Titanic, she still might not have gotten there in time because of the amount of precaution that she would have had to take steering clear of that ice field. She would not have been able to go at full speed. She would have had to weave and duck her way around about multiple icebergs had she tried to go out in the middle of the night, and possibly have injured her own self and put her own crew in danger had she done so. And this is backed up by testimony from Carpathia as well, because Carpathia, upon getting to Titanic's distress on her way to Titanic's distress location, as she entered the same ice field that Titanic was sinking in, her captain had said during the inquiries there were a couple of icebergs that Carpathia came very, very close to hitting as they were going at pretty much full speed, actually probably more than full speed because they were putting every ounce of power they could to the ship's engines to try to get there as quickly as they could. And she's racing through this ice field, and there were a couple close calls on Carpathia's part. She almost ended up hitting a couple of bergs herself. So there is the question. California's in that same ice field, even if she had responded to Titanic's distress signals, even if she had started to stream south, would she have been able to get there in time, given the extra precautionary measures she would have had to take in to protect her own crew? So it's one of the great what ifs of the Titanic disaster. Now, as for Lord, Lord ended up getting the butt of the stick. He ended up getting fired from his job at the Leyland Line in August of 1912 for undisclosed reasons. It was reported probably because of the bad negative publicity that he had gotten. And he ended up he served in a couple other uh, maritime careers up until I think about the 30s, and he lived pretty much the rest of his life trying to clear his name. I think he died in about 1962. He was alive when some of the big Titanic films came out in the 1950s, and he actually at one point was so irate at his portrayal in one of them that he had stormed into one of the corporate offices and demanded he just said, "I am Lord of the Californian." Of course, no one at that time knew what he was talking about until he kind of clarified what he was talking about. Oh, you're Captain Lord. And he was aggrieved to how he'd been portrayed in the film as, being indifferent to the ship sinking while he's warm in his bed and sleeping and everything else, but he hadn't really done much to prove that that wasn't the case in all sense of the word. So Lord ended up, and his family to this day is still trying to clear Lord's name. He had a son, I think, that died in the 1990s, and his extended family is still alive. They're still trying to clear Lord's name to this day. I think in many ways he was seen as a scapegoat because I do blame other individuals. I do blame for one Japers Ismay in part as a villain of the disaster, but Lord, I think he was in the wrong position at the wrong time, and I think while his actions are reprehensible, I think he also got scapegoated for a lot of stuff that wasn't necessarily within his control as well. So it is, as I said, it's one of the great what ifs. If Californian had actually gone to Titanic's aid, would it have actually changed much, or would not much have changed at all? But regardless of what did or did not happen, the fact that they had seen the rockets and did nothing, that's still pretty egregious that nothing was done. So that concludes for this video. Again, I just wanted to give a little bit of an overlook of the situation here. And anyone that wants to do more research on it, you can feel free to do that on your own time. There is plenty of stuff out there publicly about the California. It's, as I said, it's one of the biggest uh, focal points of the Titanic disaster that's discussed among Titanic historians. So there's no shortage of material out there for you if you really want to look into it further. So if anyone wants to do that, feel free, and I encourage you to do so. So if anyone has any comments, any questions, or anything of that sort, feel free to put them in the comment section, and I'll be more than happy to go through them when I get the opportunity to do so. And as I said, we're coming up on the 250th of the United States of the Declaration of Independence. So I'm going to try to do a couple of Revolutionary War era videos here leading into that and for the month of July. So we'll get to that here. Hopefully, we'll be able to get one here by the end of next week. So that will be what's going to be upcoming next. So hopefully, everyone has a good rest of their week, and we'll see you all back here for the next video when it comes out.